I do hear coming back from growers that some people have had to go maybe in and get maybe a ton or two of whatever compound or nitrogen that they have just to finish off a field that might run short, and they're paying significantly more than what they paid, over 100, 200 euro a ton. So, but luckily I think most people in my area got in just before that increase.
We're now entering peak planting time for crops, weather permitting. Progress across the country has been quite variable, with lighter, freer draining soils drying out more quickly than heavier soils. As the season moves on, planning for beans and spring wheat is becoming increasingly critical. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. If you're enjoying the series, we'd really appreciate it if you could follow the podcast and leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. After a long break from fieldwork, farmers are understandably eager to get the spring crops in as soon as conditions allow. I'm delighted today to be joined by Conor Kavanagh, a Teagasc Tillage Advisor from Tipperary, and Eoin Lyons, a Teagasc Tillage Advisor from Laois, to chat about planting progress over the past couple of weeks and the areas farmers should prioritise in the next few days. Eoin, can I come to you first? You might maybe tell us, how are farmers getting on in terms of planting in your area?
Yeah, I'd say up until the start of this week, it was a relatively small amount was done. And that was really just down to, it was difficult just to get consecutive days together in order to get soils dry. You're kind of getting one lovely day and good drying, but it was back to rain the following day. And that was really the problem. But I suppose there was a small area of beans and oats drilled from about kind of mid-March until the 20th of March. There was pockets there that you could get out, and maybe growers, they probably weren't as concerned as getting seed beds perfect for them crops as they might have been for barley. But like generally, the most of the spring beans now and oats, which is a relatively small area, have been drilled in the area. As regards barley, since the start of this week, I suppose since even Sunday afternoon, we've had excellent drying conditions for the past few days. And really, the area of barley has picked up considerably that has been drilled. So look, we're up around 50-60% of the barley area has been drilled in the area, or will be by the end of this week. So there are other fields then that are, they're only being ploughed now, and they're heavier kind of soils that are also colder as well, and they will be into next week before they're sown. But look, it's still plenty of time yet.
Good progress on that. And Conor, from your point of view down in Tipperary, and I know in fairness Tipperary is a big county, what's the story down there?
Yeah, I suppose similar enough to Owen there. I suppose spring malt and barley would probably be the predominant crop being sown in Tipperary, especially in South Tipperary. There's up on 55-60% of spring barley, would say, planted in South Tip, and maybe in North Tip we could be back as low as maybe 30-40%. But there is different pockets of land that would be traditionally April sown barley anyway. And from talking to clients there's some farmers that put in spring barley as late as the last week in April back in 2023, and it still performed reasonably well. So there is still time, but I think as what's kind of being reiterated is they're basically getting the seed bed correct, not mucking it in and waiting for, probably, as Owen said, maybe the ideal consecutive, maybe 2 dry days rather than just mucking it in after 1 dry day.
Just in terms of beans, Conor, Owen was mentioning there's probably a good bit of it done in his area. In terms of beans from your side of the house, money in or much to go?
The bean area in Tipperary has definitely increased on last year. I'd say there's up on 80% of the beans planted, only a small few acres left to go in. There is a small area of spring oats went in as well, and there'll be very little spring wheat planted in Tipperary, bar maybe 1 or 2 farms that need to comply with the 3-crop rule.
And in terms, Conor, of seed beds, Owen mentioned it a second ago. What have they been like? I mean, I know some of those, maybe it's kind of similar to Owen. Maybe some of the beans were started early enough. I know there's one contractor I was talking to not too far away from you down there, and he was planting beans when, well, I'm not really sure what the conditions were like at the time. Did you see many seed beds out there? What were they like?
Yeah, well, to be fair, seedbed conditions were surprisingly good given all the rain over the winter. I think the cover crops played a massive part, especially for farmers using a plough-based system. I think the seedbeds actually, after the cover crops ploughed up very well, they were fine, and there was a good till on them. Any farmers kind of using minimum tillage, they're finding it maybe a small bit more difficult to work as there was a big mass of cover crops and a big area cover crops sown with the acre scheme, and also the Farming for Water EIP, so the cover crop area was well up. but it did definitely play a part in protecting the soil, and I suppose protecting the soil and also making it that bit easier to till in the springtime for a plough based farmer.
So from that plough-based farmer, Connor, it was just a bit more friable, was it? It wasn't coming up as lumpy, or what was the story? Do you think?
Yeah, definitely more friable. Yeah, not as cloddy as it would have been with some of the minimum tillage systems, but obviously it's that bit slower to work to get through the acreages.
Any comment as regards people talking about, whether it was a bit drier underneath or whether there was maybe easier to plough it in terms of that it was, having living roots in a soil generally makes it a little bit looser anyway in terms of kind of draft for a tractor getting through.
Yeah, without a doubt, yeah, it was definitely easier to get through with living roots, and I suppose the fact that there was cover the harvest was quite early last year in a lot of cases, so cover crops went early, so there was good cover over the soil as well, which definitely helped in maybe drying out the soil underneath.
And Owen, just as regards the Connor mentioned a little bit there around the non-inversion or mintill type fellas out there, and there's a good bit of that kind of going on. Do you see that? Given the spring is maybe a little bit more difficult than normal, is are people kind of sticking with it, or are they switching back maybe to ploughing, or what way is it?
Yeah, so look at I've had a few people that are, I suppose they're min-till farmers predominantly, but still have the plough in the shed type farmers, I suppose. And a lot of them have said, especially for spring barley, that just in order to get going and get crops sown, just it find it very difficult to get it to dry out. And I go back to what I said earlier about getting them days together to get it dry. And when you only need the day or two in the plough situation, you need three, four, five in the min-till, and we're just not getting there. But look, I suppose from a sowing of beans or an oats point of view, it seems to be happening fairly okay because maybe you just don't need the seedbed quite as good for them. But from a spring barley point of view, it's getting it is getting quite tricky in a min-till scenario to get it just where you are. I suppose just to come in on what Conor was saying there about the cover crops, um, definitely people have been saying to me that have been growing the cover crops, so maybe been growing it for the first time, given the EIP scheme, that you are getting that it is the living roots are keeping that soil drier. But there's also another camp of people there that, if you remember back to early January, there was a spell there where the weather was fairly good in the first week or two of January, and people decided to go in maybe and desiccate them cover crops or maybe roll them during there was a frosty period there. In anticipation that you might be drilling maybe a month later, because I said a lot of my people that I'm dealing with will be rolling malt and barley, and if February came right, they would be in drilling. But obviously, what happened that didn't get a chance, and prolonged rainfall on a bare soil is meaning that we're actually having the opposite effect to what we were saying and what Connor is seeing. That you're not getting that drying ability, and it's coming up quite cloddy. And it's harder to break them lumps now as they dry out. Like so, where some people are getting away with maybe a plow and straight in with a one pass or something. If you had that bare soil, you're probably going back in another cultivation just to get the seedbed right.
So do you think the ideal scenario then in that scenario, Owen, would have been to leave that cover crop for a little bit longer?
But sure, look at yeah, like in hindsight, we'd say yes, but like ideally, we'd be trying to get a 5 week period between desiccation or removal of the cover crop and in with your planting. And as I said, look, a lot of people on the soils around South Kildare and Laois, it'd be drier type soils, it'd be soils that you could get in the last week of February with malt and barley, in a lot of years. But look at that just wasn't going to happen this year. So look, it's easy to be right in hindsight, but that's correct. If we had left them, I suppose, in the ground longer and leaving roots in the soil, it would have probably helped when at this stage when we're trying to get crops planted.
So I presume, though, I know you kind of said there's a number of people in your area who are predominantly mintill, and they might be maybe switching towards a plough, but it has been a nice few, a nice week that ground is drying out that bit more. Are some of them going to stick with it, do you think, or where is it going to be?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there will be people that will stick with it, and it is still possible to get there. It's really it's the farmers there that have a lot of land to cover, or they're maybe doing contracting work and things like that. They probably had to go and drill maybe some days last week, just to try and get work started and get through work. Whereas there's other guys then, I suppose, that don't have that them pressures that can afford to wait that bit longer. So really, look, it is still possible to get a perfect seedbed for Mintil, but it all comes down to your situation. I suppose the labour, the amount of time you have in order to put towards getting your crop drilled, and the amount of work on your plate, really.
So have you any, two or three kind of, I suppose, essentials that anybody who is going for a mint hill in the spring barley situation that they should really, have in their mind that before they, I suppose, pull the pin to actually go at it?
Well, look, firstly, you need to get the soil dry. Yeah, I suppose if you're going in with a grubber type system and coming in, or maybe direct drilling or strip tilling, the soil needs to be dry before you go at that system. So it's realistically, it's just waiting and being patient. And I know, look, we're into April now, and it's hard to be patient, but patience is key in order to get the soil dry before you go and try and put an implement in the ground. And I suppose the second thing is to try and make sure that as the soil starts to dry out now after that prolonged period, you are going to get that lumpy, cloddy soil. I suppose spring barley in that type of scenario, you're just not going to get our target of, 290, 300 plants per meter squared, because in them rough seabeds, it just won't happen for you. So it's really important, if you do need a second run of something, or we need to go in on a headland again, or maybe on tram lines or something like that, take your time and probably complete that action just to make sure we get that good seabed.
Conor, you said, and you're right, I think it's obviously not too late to sow spring barley. Maybe there's some other crops we're probably outside the ideal sown window, such as beans, spring wheat, of which you're saying there's very little of it. But certainly for spring barley and perhaps even oats, there's still time enough to put that in. From farmers that are already planting spring barleys, are you seeing anything, particularly of note in terms of some of the seed size or 1,000 grain weights from some of the spring barley varieties that people should be aware of, I suppose, so that they adjust their seeding weights if they're going from one variety to the next, or even maybe within varieties?
There is variation, I suppose, between varieties and within varieties, but there's nothing too extreme. Not like in 2023 where we had some Polish varieties come into the country. I'm most of the 1,000 grain weights are ranging between maybe 52 and 56, which is roughly given anywhere between 180 to 190 kilograms per hectare, or anything between 11 and a half to 12 stone. And in theory, farmers would often be pulling back seeding rate coming into April because of a higher percentage establishment, but just given the wet soil and maybe not less than 100% ideal seedbed, you'd still probably want to be going with your 11 and a half to 12 stone per acre.
You were planting that, Conor, to 300 plants established per meter squared and an establishment rate of 85%.
85 to hopefully 90% for
Okay,
this first week in April, you'd be hoping.
right. Okay.
And I suppose just when you did say about other crops, then yeah, there is still probably 15-20% of spring beans left to go in. But from talking to maybe some of my colleagues from the northeast of the country, there's up on 50 and 60% of spring beans in areas still to go in. So it is possibly pushing on maybe a small bit later for beans in if you're going into maybe the second half of April, definitely possibly getting too late for beans there, as you would be looking at maybe a mid to late September harvest, which we all know isn't ideal.
Sure. Probably into October, I'd say, if you're starting to get into there. And I suppose the other side of that, to be very vulnerable to drought, I suppose, along during the year as well. So you wouldn't be expecting big yields after mid-April, or everything would have to go very, very, very right. Conor, you mentioned earlier, the high winter rainfall that was there this year. Is there a need then for some of these spring crops going in that there's nitrogen is applied to that seed bed, or maybe even extra nitrogen in comparison to what farmers would normally be planning?
Yeah, I suppose, look, because the spring barley is going to get up and get away reasonably quick, we're hopefully going to get a good month of April, because we badly need it after the start of the year we've got. So, yeah, you're probably definitely as well off going with maybe 30, 40 units of nitrogen into the seed bed to get that barley up and going. And then as soon as the tram lines become visible, you're going with the remainder nitrogen, which will hopefully be maybe towards the middle to second half of April.
So it's nothing particularly different necessarily than other years in terms of that nitrogen level.
I wouldn't imagine so, Mike. Right, given that almost all spring barley ground in Tipperary would have had a catch crop on it, so I'd be hoping that nitrogen would, or the residual nitrogen in the soil wouldn't have been washed away. It would have been remained in situ with the catch crops in place. It might be that bit slower releasing throughout the year, but definitely with the current nitrogen price, I wouldn't be going with extra nitrogen in spring barley crops this year.
Owen, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, just one addition, I suppose. This kind of relates to most of the people I be dealing with in the Midlands there. The majority of spring barley grown in my area will be malting barley. And so as we go into April, there is another thing there in relation to the malt, and that's the protein and the protein in the grain. And I suppose the fear is, if there's uptake of nitrogen by the barley after growth stage 32, that nitrogen is going to go straight to the grain and increase our protein level, and then we might be failing for malt. And if we take, the difference between malt and price and feed and price at the minute is significant. So you want to give you every opportunity to try and get it across the line. So look, taking all that in mind, it might be no harm in a malting scenario as we go progress into into April, is maybe just increase your rate of nitrogen that's going into seabed, maybe up to, typically we'd be going with around the 40 units. You might up that to maybe 60 or 70, just to make sure that, I suppose, maybe it just might guarantee you more going forward if we do run into a dry spell, which, by the laws of averages, we're nearly due a prolonged dry spell. And I suppose maybe that is a bit of a fear there too, that if we get the barley established, and we're putting on a high level of nitrogen during a dry period, will that nitrogen be washed in for the barley as well? So it's just something to keep in mind.
And are you, for the, as crops go later into April, are you recommending the same amount of nitrogen or slightly less nitrogen for those crops that they're going for malting in comparison to stuff that was sown earlier?
I think you'd have to keep in mind to reduce where you're going. But I also would keep in mind where the price is as well. Like, you have to optimize, I suppose, yield as best you can with trying to get the across the line for malt and barley. And as I said, look, the forward price for malt and barley at the minute there is 225 euro a ton. Feed is a good bit below that, like at the moment. So it's just, you want to try and give it every opportunity you can. So typically, like for a mid-March sown crop, we're probably in around 150 kilos, 120 units of nitrogen on our malting crop. I don't, you would be considering dropping that maybe back by 10, 15 units an acre, maybe, just to give you the best chance. But also, I suppose, we're in a scenario this year where up until now, there was a big part of your malt and barley contract was to do with the still and barley. And we know the still and barley needs a lower grain protein than brewing barley. But, I suppose the tables have turned on that now, and really where the brewing barley is priority, because of the whiskey trade has gone down so much, the still and barley is not as sought after. So look, there's not as big of a push as there was to reduce nitrogen in order to get that distilled in barley. So that's something, I suppose, to keep in
Something to
mind.
bear in mind as you go. Just as regards fertilizers, Owen, both yourself and Conor have mentioned it. As a matter of interest, do you know what your clients that are out there, did a majority of them actually have most of the fertilizer on stock, in the yard before those prices went up?
A lot of growers, they did leave it late into the spring to actually go to the market. And I think the reason for that was, there was an awful lot of uncertainty, I suppose, where fertilizer price was going to end up. And if you took the relationship between, green feed barley price or wheat price versus the cost of nitrogen, there was I suppose the grain price wasn't stacking up with where fertilizer price was. And I
Sure.
suppose that left people to wait. But I think for the majority of people I'm dealing with, they did get in before, I suppose, the war, the impact of the war had an impact on prices. So I suppose there wasn't too bad from that point of view. But I do hear coming back from growers that some people have had to go maybe in and get maybe a ton or two of whatever compound or nitrogen that they have just to finish off feed they might have ran short, and they're
Mm.
paying significantly more than what they paid, over 100, €200 a ton. So, but luckily, I think most people in my area
Most
got
have it.
in just before that increase.
And Conor, down your part of the world, something similar to the farmers up in Laois?
Yeah, to be fair, I think tillage farms are very good. They have their heads screwed on. I'd say 70 to 80% of the clients would have had either fertilizer in the yard and ordered before the mad price increase, and that will be a big help to them going forward. And to be fair to a lot of the merchants in Tipperary, they were in contact with their grain suppliers, telling them that price increases were going up week on week to get it ordered. And I think most of the farmers did take the advice of the merchant and order the fertilizer before it took the 100 to €200 a ton jump.
So finally, Conor, obviously fertilizer is expensive, and if people have to go back to the merchant to top up a little bit, it is obviously going to cost them an awful lot more. But look, it was expensive in the first place, even before it went up. What would your top 3 tips in terms of trying to make sure that the fertilizer is being used as efficiently as they can on farms?
The top 3, first of all, would be having soil samples in place for every field, and which will allow you to have a nutrient management plan, which is almost essential for every tillage farmer now. So if you have a nutrient management plan in place, it'll tell you basically what levels of P and K and the soil pH is. So basically, if you can have your pH, your P and your K at optimum level, you're going to maximize the nitrogen use efficiency. So I suppose having having a nutrient management plan and maximizing the nitrogen use efficiency is probably the first point, and also maybe slightly pulling back the nitrogen rate on crops after the likes of maybe definitely beans and even your break crops, the likes of your oats and your oilseed rape. Secondly, then I suppose ideally, if you could replace some of the bagged fertilizer with an organic nutrient source, the likes of your slurry, so your pig slurry, your cat slurry, farmyard manure, or even a lot of places get if you're close to a factory, you'd have the likes of belly grass or sludge to maybe go out on stubble ground before it's ploughed, which would be ideal for for spring crops. So spring crops will have a higher nitrogen recovery rate than winter crops. They'll recover up to 50% of what goes out on. So if you could get slurry out just before sowing or farmyard manure out, you'll get a higher return in terms of your nitrogen. And then I suppose the final one is correcting your soil pH. It sounds very simple, Michael, but the amount of soil samples that come into the office every spring with a pH below the optimum, kind of 6.5, 6.7. A lot of pH come in just below 6 even, which has a lime requirement of over 3 tons to the acre. If your lime isn't right, Michael, you're not going to get efficient uptake of P, K or nitrogen. So, and lime is definitely going to be a winner this year. Like if you have if your pH isn't correct, you're not going to have good crops, or you're not going to have efficient use of your fertilizer. So that's probably the first thing I'd be correcting.
It always comes back to the basics, I suppose, Conor. And if people can make sure the basics are covered, they'll probably get the most out of it probably after that.
Definitely on a year like this, Michael, with fertilizer prices where they are, just having your pH right is the first kind of stepping stone.
Listen, guys, we're after running out of time. It's great to touch base with you as regards what's happening in towards the Midlands in Ireland. Certainly there's a lot of work done, but there's a lot more to be done. Eoin and Conor, thanks very much for your time, and we'll be chatting to you later on in the season.
Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for this episode, and my thanks to Conor and Eoin for joining me on the show. So finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.